of our 25 participants here, recordings on. Jeremy, passing on to you, just appreciating that you will have some questions coming in the chat over time. So we're going to use the chat as the basis to help you, field any questions, which I've been told in advance there are. So over to you, sir.
Oh, sounds good. Well, good to see a lot of old friends today on the call. I think I know most of you in one form or another, though not everybody. So yeah, I today wanted to take a little bit of time just to give background on the new legislation that was introduced in the House of Representatives on digital identity in mid-September, and give a little bit of the backstory in terms of how it got introduced. I can walk through the bill. And then from there, we can, talk about it. So I think most of you know that, I was involved in launching the Better Identity Coalition in early 2018. It was an organization that emerged in the wake of the Equifax breach, when there were a whole bunch of questions that were emerging from both government and industry around the implications of that breach on identity systems. And it was, from my perspective, the most attention government had really given to this since they first launched the N-stick several years earlier. So I was, after getting pulled into a bunch of different conversations with folks in industry and government, we finally got a bunch of folks together from different companies who were interested in this in our offices at Venable, and I guess it was around, mid-November 2017. And what emerged from it was there seems to be a lot of interest in this topic. The ideas that are coming out of the government, while they sound good and led to the headline risk, things like, hey, let's ban the credit bureaus from collecting Social Security numbers, given that, one of them just, lost over 140 million of them in a breach, would actually have made things worse. I mean, that would, if the credit bureaus can't collect SSN in the US, our economy would come crashing to a halt in about 36 hours because nobody could get credit the way our system works. So, the idea was, why don't we actually form a group of leading companies to come up with a set of, consensus policy positions that we can put forward for things the government actually could and should do to help. And that was how the coalition was born. We launched with about a dozen members in, I think, late January, early February of 2018. In July of 2018, we unveiled our policy blueprint for better identity in America, which, sort of framed the problem, from, up-to-date terms, sort of laid out why we're in the situation we're in, and then laid out several things that the government could do both in the executive branch as well as the legislative branch to address it. And, the bill was, or not the bill, the blueprint was, got really good bipartisan reception, good reception from folks in industry as well as, privacy and security advocates. And out of that, we started to develop, I'd say, some fans on Capitol Hill. So when it was released in 2018, speakers included the Republican and Democratic co-chair of the House Cybersecurity Caucus, Mike McCall on the Republican side, and Jim Langevin on the Democratic side, Grant Snyder, who at the time was the senior White House National Security Council cyber policy official, now colleague of mine at Venable, but that's another story. But he came and spoke in favor of it as well. And I guess it was about a year and a half ago, Congressman Bill Foster, who is an Illinois congressman, who I think there's a few folks on the call who are familiar with him. He's an unusual congressman in that I think he's the only PhD physicist who's a member of Congress. He's very interested in digital identity and fintech. He actually, without us ever talking to him, came across our policy blueprint and started asking companies around town about it. And I actually started getting calls from, some government affairs folks at, some banks and vendors and others, saying, what have you done to this guy? You can't stop talking about this paper you guys put out. Said, who's Bill Foster? So we reached out, talked to his staff, quickly got brought in, got to know him. I think some of you were in the room. He got him to do a keynote at the Identiverse conference in Washington in the summer of 2019. That was a bit of a hit, where he did something which I didn't expect, which was he put a slide up on stage that said, the Better Identity Coalition has an approach that's both technologically and politically feasible to address these issues, which I thought, from my perspective, was a nice way to say it, in that, we've been looking at this topic both from a matter of, not just what could work, but how do you actually get something done in this town where things are so polarized and identity has, depending on where you look at it, can be a very political issue. He had a hearing in September of last year. He's the chair of the AI task force in the House Financial Services Committee, so we were asked to testify there. He gave copies of our blueprint out to every member of Congress who came to the hearing. And out of the hearing, he came to us and said, look, I think I want to do more here. And that was when the idea of doing a actual bill based on our policy blueprint emerged. So a little bit of background, this was something we actually consciously chose not to pursue when we first released the policy blueprint for two reasons. One, almost everything that's in the policy blueprint doesn't require an act of Congress to actually move forward. Most of it can just be done by action in the executive branch, be it an executive order or something else that you could do to just get an agency to do a thing. And in fact, we saw, I think, the first step of that in May of 2019, when the White House Office of Management and Budget put out Memo 19-17, the ICAM policy memo that I think a lot of folks in Kantara are familiar with, which embraced our core recommendation. It rephrased it, but it basically had language that said, agencies shall establish what they called, I think it was privacy enhanced APIs that can be used to support identity proofing events in both the public and private sector based in consumer consent to validate attributes for identity proofing. I'm getting the language wrong there, but that was the basic gist of it. But, OMB policies tend to be long on words and often short on follow-up and action in terms of what agencies actually do to follow up on them. Kantara is certainly no stranger to the challenges of getting the U.S. government to, actually follow what's in these OMB policies, including ones that have called for federation over the years. So, the idea of the legislation was, how do we codify what's already in that policy and actually try to put some deadlines and, action items around it to accelerate things. But I was saying we weren't pursuing legislation not only because we didn't really need it necessarily, but also because the way that the Congress is organized, the jurisdictional issues in terms of all the different things that we called for in the policy blueprint are really hellacious. And so, if you have a bill that's introduced and suddenly 5 different committees in the House and Senate each can claim jurisdiction and they want to have hearings on it and it can't advance unless they all sign off, it's really hard to get anything done. And so our take was, let's tackle this in bite-sized pieces instead. But the flip side was when Foster said, that aside, we really want to get an omnibus bill out there that does everything because that's, a great way to advance stuff. Our take was, yeah, sure, we're happy to work with you on that. And, having a champion on the Hill who can drive that forward is really helpful. So that was what led to the bill. And so I think if you look at it, particularly some of the sections in back start to get a little disjointed, it's because they're pointing to different elements from the blueprint. So, to walk through the bill, I think one of the things that's notable from the start is who co-sponsored it. So, Foster's a Democrat, as is Jim Langevin, but he got Barry Loudermilk, who's a Georgia Republican from the Atlanta area, who's very, he's the ranking Republican on the task force in the Financial Services Committee that Foster works with, also pretty savvy on fintech issues. And then John Katko, who is the ranking Republican on the House Homeland Security Cybersecurity Subcommittee. So, again, a pretty, sort of 4 serious members who are used to working with each other. And I think the fact that it was their 4 names that were on there, instantly demonstrates to others in DC, hey, this is a serious proposal. These are serious legislators who are, looking at this from a bipartisan basis. And I think that's helped to frame all this. So section 1's the title. Section 2 is the findings, which are arguably too long, but a number of people have told me that they're not detailed enough. Findings from a legislative standpoint, frankly, don't matter. In that they don't have any force of law. It's just a way to sort of set the stage. And so I'm not going to spend a lot of time going through them, other than the one that's probably the most important is finding 12, which says it should be the policy of the government to use the authorities and capabilities of government to enhance security, reliability, privacy, and convenience of digital ID solutions that support and protect transactions between individuals, government entities, and businesses that enable Americans to prove who they are online. I think that one's notable in that it actually says this is what the government should do, as opposed to just laying out some of the issues around it. The other point I want to make is, if you guys have read our policy blueprint, this bill doesn't cover everything in there. It only covers a subset of it. So I think the idea that was arguably the most radical in the blueprint, and the one that's gotten the attention the most out of our 5 recommendations, is that we need to make it a formal government priority to invest in next generation solutions for remote identity proofing, and that the government's going to have to play a very specific role in that. And, I think I've talked to a lot of you individually about it, but just from a purpose of level setting, I think one of the things we did in the policy blueprint was started to change the debate within, government and politics around digital identity. So many times, whether I've been in or out of government, when these issues come up, immediately somebody says, hey, why don't you guys do a national ID card? Have you seen what the Estonians have done? And they throw that on the table, and everybody goes, gah! And they run off to their corner because that's really politically charged, and they throw stuff at it, right? You guys have all seen this. And it gets really, the whole conversation gets derailed because now we're talking about national ID cards. And then the discussion kind of dies, which I've always found frustrating, because the discussion's never been about a card. It's been about how do we do digital identity? And there's a lot of different ways that that can happen. And so what I think we did that seemed to capture a lot of attention in the policy blueprint was to say, look, we don't need a national ID card. In fact, we don't need new systems at all. In fact, the problem is we have too many cards. We've got a number of nationally recognized authoritative identity systems already in this country, but they're all stuck in the paper and plastic world, and they're split between the federal and the state and the local level. So, look, I got my birth certificate from Oakland County, Michigan. My driver's license is from the District of Columbia, and my passport's from the State Department. There isn't any coordinated way that I can use even one of those documents online, let alone all 3 of them. And so the idea is that we need to start to get government into the game by, creating a model, not where government's just selling your data willy-nilly or sharing it, but kind of turning that model on its head, where any consumer can proactively ask an agency who already has issued them some sort of a identity credential or even just an identifier, in the case of the Social Security Administration, to vouch for them when they're looking to do something online. And I think that idea of putting this as a user-centric, creating a user-centric model where government's now essentially doing you a favor to let you do things where the risk model is such that you might not be able to do it otherwise, is something that's captured a lot of attention. So the bill is largely focused on what would it take to do that. And there's really 3 primary components in section 3, 4, and 5 that are focused on, coming up with a way to jumpstart that. So, I'll shift to section 4 first, in that it's notable. This is the standards portion of it. One of the questions obviously that comes up is, no matter how you structure it, there's going to be a bunch of security and privacy concerns. And so the question our members have always asked is, look, how do we actually set a high bar for security and privacy, as opposed to, have this, be done in a way that somehow is going to create new risks there. And so, the take was to go to, our friends at NIST and essentially ask them to do a framework here outlining how do you actually stand up these architectures and these systems, whether it's through APIs or another type of technology that would allow, federal, state, and local agencies to all set up these attribute validation services in a way that sets a high bar for privacy and security. And so there, NIST is directed to weigh in and basically tell government at all levels what they should do. Some people have asked, well, isn't that already 863? And I've said, no, this is not. That's all about, as you guys know, how to, do identity proofing and create a credential and how to use it and federate it. This is much more about, if I'm exposing data that's in authoritative systems somehow, how is it secured? How is privacy architected into it so that I'm, giving people meaningful consent and opportunities, and or ensuring that the consent they give is meaningful, that they understand choices. How do you? We can talk all about what that should mean at a high level. Our take is, let's not get specific in legislation. Let's tell the people at NIST, who can probably do this better than all of us, that they should go figure this out for the government. Back to the task force, the idea was, the federal government can do this on its own, but really, because this involves states and also localities, how do you get everybody in the room to come up with a whole of government approach? And so, it tasked the executive office of the president, which could be a lot of entities within the White House underneath that would be up to the White House to decide, to set up an improving digital identity task force. It lays out a bunch of federal agencies that are largely focused on agencies that are already in the identity business one way or another. So, Treasury, Homeland Security, State, Education, because of federal student aid and the identities they manage. I've had a lot of questions of, should one agency be in there or another? I think there's a lot of discussion about that right now. I also want to be clear, this was Foster's office who wrote the bill. We provided input into it and worked closely with them on it, but this is ultimately their legislation and not ours. It would bring in a substantial number of state government members and local government members as well, who would be, jointly appointed by Republicans and Democratic leadership in the House and the Senate. And, they basically have a bunch of duties, which is, to identify what entities in government at different levels of government are in the identity business. Are there restrictions any of them face if they wanted to start doing attribute validation services? Are there any laws that might need to be changed or regulations that would, be required to get them in it? Talk about a standards-based architecture that would enable agencies to provide services in a way that does all the things that we care about. And that, of course, would, then point to the NIST work. Identify funding models. I think a lot of Social Security Administration has stood up the ECBSV system over the last year. It's funded by the banks. And, big industry is willing to pay for these services if they're reasonably priced. And so, is this something where the government needs to invest, or is it something that there are other models that might work? And this is this next question, would a fee model work? Are there other steps that you need to take to improve security, reliability, privacy, convenience, yada, yada, assess risks around potential criminal exploitation of these services? And this is an important part here. To the extent practicable, get input and collaborate with interested parties in the private sector. One of the questions I've gotten from a lot of people is, why isn't there a role for industry on the task force? And the way Foster's office, sort of ended up on this, and we sort of, work with them in getting there, there's two reasons. One, at the end of the day, this is about the government figuring out how they're going to expose services to the private sector and to, each other. And so it's not about something as audacious as NSTIC that we tried several years ago, where it was all about how do we get the private sector together to figure out everything in digital identity. This is much more limited just on attribute validation services. And so there's an element of it that you want to hear from the private sector, but it's about what's the government going to do for an architecture. The second is an obscure law in the US called FACA, the Federal Advisory Committee Act, which basically states that if you start pulling together industry in a room with government in a situation like this, all the requirements of this act are triggered, which, from my perspective, really slows things down quite a bit and makes things much more complicated than they need to be. And so if there's a way to actually drive action on this quickly rather than through a long drawn-out process, I was told long ago, in fact, it was right after 9/11, there was a congressional hearing looking at transportation security. Norm Mineta, who was the Secretary of Transportation for the Bush administration, but a Democrat, was being asked about all these new committees that the Department of Transportation had stood up after the attacks, and was asked, is there a Federal Advisory Committee Act problem? And he looked at the chairman and said, Mr. Chairman, I can assure you there's not going to be any fucka problem. And the whole room, probably the first time they could laugh in a while. So I've learned you don't want fucka problems when you're doing these sorts of things, which is why it's, structured the way that it is. Gives them 180 days to put a report out. The idea is this shouldn't be that complicated. Let's try to drive action quickly. I covered the standards portion. The next big part is digital identity innovation grants. So the reason we focused here is, our take has been, look, of all the different, identity issuers in the US, the DMV is the driver's license bureaus. That's the one place most adult Americans are going to go through a pretty robust in-person identity proofing process. It's been made, a little bit sharper and more standardized thanks to the Real ID Act. So, if anybody's in a great position to cover most of the country, it's going to be the DMVs. The challenge is the DMVs don't have the money. Most of them aren't very motivated to actually get in this business. we're seeing some good pilots, with mobile driver's licenses, or even going beyond pilots to full deployments in a few states. But, left to their own devices, it's going to take the states 10 or 15 years to get ubiquitous coverage there. Let's accelerate it. And so one of the things that the only place we really called for substantial new dollars in the policy blueprint was grant dollars to state DMVs to basically give them a carrot, an incentive to start investing in these systems. And so it directs DHS to establish a new grant program to basically help jumpstart, states converting from issuing plastic cards that say you can operate a motor vehicle to really being more of a digital identity bureau. One of the things that we did fight for in this was an inclusion aspect, given how many people can't get a driver's license easily today. There's dozens of reasons where you might not have the breeder documents or the ability to prove who you are. Issues like if you're fleeing, a domestic violence situation, are you bringing your driver's license? Do you have your passport and social security number? And then if you don't, how do you get restarted? It's actually a real problem in the country. So the idea was, for giving the states money, let's make sure that they allocate at least 10% of the grants to services helping people who have these challenges. There's no dollars that are formally provided here. The way the U.S. system works, knowing this is a global group, is first you authorize money to be spent, and then another committee, the Appropriations Committee, every year decides if they're going to find funding for it. But it is at least authorized there. That's really the meat of the bill. There's these two provisions, Section 6 and 7. This is about looking at where there might be outdated legislative requirements mandating that industry or government collect and retain SSN. So many of the problems we have with Social Security number in terms of the overuse of it is that there's actually legal and regulatory requirements that say that different companies or government agencies have to use the SSN as an identifier, even when there's other alternative approaches. One of the things we found talking to the Senate Finance and the House Ways and Means Committee when we were working on our policy blueprint is nobody's ever bothered to inventory what those requirements are or if they're relevant. So we focused on that. And then Section 7 is actually, it's a pretty wacky one that I expect to change if anything goes forward. The idea was originally to try and find, one of the things we called for in our blueprint is we said, look, we have things like Executive Order 13681, which was signed by President Obama in 2014. I co-wrote it, that, said all agencies that are sharing personal data, through a citizen-facing application need to have an effective identity proofing process that needs to be using MFA. It's never really been enforced evenly. And so the idea was, is there a way to do that? Where Foster's office ended up was basically that the Department of Homeland Security would issue binding operational directives to actually follow the NIST guidance and the OMB memo from earlier this year. And a lot of people looked at that and said, wait, you're going to direct DHS to issue this directive? It may not be the way to get it done, but I think there will probably be some more work on that one going forward. So that's sort of the bill in summary. I see there's a whole bunch of questions that have popped up in chat, so I haven't gone through those, but should I just start to go through those, Colin, and we'll talk through stuff one by one, or do you want to talk more generally?
No, I think it's good to go to the questions and then some open discussion. I just want to take this opportunity to thank you so much, Jeremy, for laying it out in a beautifully high level but informative way. Also lovely to see Kantara's global membership here, Japan, Australia, UK, other parts of Europe, North and South America, and Canada, and so on. So it's really good to see global interest. And what we actually expected was to be something of primarily US interest. But as myself, knowing how it was in New Zealand when NIST 863 version 1 came out, it's to a great extent NIST was on a stage there in the middle of a stage with all the world watching on. I think that's potentially what we might see here as well. I do want to just point out that some of the questions, I've been looking at the questions, and to a point, they may have been part answered along the way, but could you just start at the top? I think the very start was the first one from, was it?
Yeah,
Steve?
so Steve Wilson says Foster's identity keynote was excellent. Agreed. No new identity systems needed. Here, here. Sal asked, you covered the idea of a data trust in your policy doc. No, not explicitly. Question from, we can talk more about that, but let me get through these first. Question from Martin Smith. What's the relationship, if any, between the Foster bill and a separate legislative effort that Foster has been leading to repeal a 20-plus year prohibition on HHS developing or exploring the idea of a national patient identifier? So the answer there is there's no direct connection other than Foster's really interested in identity. And we've actually been helping him on that front as well from the coalition. When they were seeking votes in the House this time, we were able to make this, this bill passed a year ago originally, or this amendment, and there was, a divided vote. This time it was passed unanimously, and we did a little bit of work behind the scenes, trying to knock out some of the Republican opposition to that so that it could advance forward. So that's happening separately, but the two aren't the same thing. And then Martin also asked, would it not be a good idea to have HHS in the task force? Yes. In fact, HHS has told me they're mad that they're not. Would it be a good idea to put the NSA or the FBI in there? NSA, probably not. Law enforcement, maybe. I think that's probably worth talking about. I think NSA, anytime you introduce them in, could be tricky. We do have Homeland Security there in part because they're responsible for government-wide cybersecurity these days. So, but I think there's, we also, I'll say there was an important provision which says, this is who we think should be at the table and the heads of anybody else who the president chooses to invite. So it is not an exclusive list. It was just trying to set the stage for starting point. How does the coalition foresee the allocation of liability and risk in the event of fraud-related or other identity-related losses? We don't. This is all limited just to government setting up attribute validation services. SSA has already done this with ECBSV. The banks aren't going to sue SSA, and SSA is not going to accept liability if they say there really is a Martin Smith with a particular date of birth and SSN who's not dead, and it turns out there's not. It's just, does this match what's in the records? And so I think it's a much simpler approach that doesn't get into the more complicated issues around federation, including how to allocate liability. The idea is let's keep this more narrowly scoped. And as some of you have heard me, half joke about this many times. If you read our policy blueprint, there's a lot of problems we don't have answers to or recommendations on. We are not to solve every problem in Identity Coalition. We are the better Identity Coalition. Let's try to see where there's areas where we think we can make things materially better while acknowledging there's some stuff we just don't know how to solve. John Wonderlook asks, is there a plan to address international interoperability? Not in the bill, but it is one of our 5 priorities that we called for. So that the 5 things that we called for were prioritizing remote ID proofing systems, rethinking the use of the SSN, recognizing it's not one thing, it's 2. It's both an identifier and it's an authenticator, and it's useless as the latter, but actually kind of harmless as the former if you stop architecting your systems to pretend that it's got security value. The third is promoting the adoption of strong authentication, where honestly, we don't call for government to do a lot there, given that industry's getting a lot of this figured out right now with things like FIDO and behavior analytics and whatnot. It focuses on some policy proposals, but there's not a ton of action. The fourth is international coordination and harmonization, where our basic take was, we really actually put a lot on Treasury at the time, given how much of this ultimately comes down on a global basis to stuff around KYC and account opening. Treasury's been a very big fan of the blueprint. They invited us in to work with them when the FATF was doing their guidance over the last couple of years. And, we have weighed in as a coalition in places like the UK and Europe as they're, looking at rethinking in the UK, the post-verify world, and Europe, everything going on with EIDAS and beyond. There's, as you guys know, a lot of ambitious ideas there. So we've been weighing in, I would say, opportunistically. I'll say the idea of attribute validation services Our blueprint seems to have influence both what the UK is looking to do with their, document checking service with passports, as well as some of the things that the EC is proposing. And so, I just had a call with, the Luxembourg team yesterday. They, are, how would I say it, excited there's a new administration. They think it'll, create some new opportunities for closer collaboration between Europe and the US again. And, interested in our ideas in terms of what that looks like. My take was to take a few months to figure out who's important in all of these things. But, at a macro level, yeah, I think if we can, whether it's looking to common standards or common frameworks, or, even exploring mutual recognition of different digital identity systems that emerge. So, the point I keep making to European friends is, we're so far behind here in having a system that we could want to be mutually recognized that it's a little premature to worry about some of those things. So Martin talks about FACA. Nobody wants to have a FACA problem. John says intersection with and comments on Real ID. So there, I'll say we, said sidestep the question of whether the Real ID Act was a good thing or not, because that's something people still want to argue sometimes. Our take on it is it established a federal standard for how to do identity proofing and issuance of a secure credential. And again, people can argue about whether that could be stronger or weaker or different. There's, some legislative proposals now to give mobile driver's licenses the legal equivalent of the physical card, which, we're pretty excited about. Our take is, Real ID is the law of the land. Most states are implementing it. And the problem is you go through this real pain in the ass of a process to get your driver's license now, in many cases more than you used to, and all you get is a plastic card. And so we want to be able to leverage that federally standardized process to be used in the digital world as well. And I think that's, if you read our policy blueprint, that's the main point we make is, if you got to go through the trouble of in-person proofing once, why can't you ask the DMV to vouch for you when you're trying to go through an account opening process someplace else?
Which is good, because John is the chair of Kantara's MDL discussion group, specializing in the privacy and identity piece. So that's why he's asking. Okay.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of good work you guys are doing there, and a lot of work other organizations need to do. Our take is just, we're trying to focus largely at the policy layer. At a policy layer, we're saying these things are good. We should find ways to use them and accelerate their adoption. And I think that's, sort of how our, what our take has been. Steve notes, if there's not business involvement in the task force, the very name of the thing, improving digital identity, might continue to sound like a government ID program. Great to see actual focus on attribute validation, but the specter of national ID will remain. Yeah, I think I would, agree with almost everything there, Steve. I mean, this specifically is a government ID program, or it's a government attribute validation program specifically. But I wouldn't argue with you there. But if you want to jump in, any other comments on that?
Thanks, Jeremy. Yeah, it's just an observation that especially in the current climate, national ID continues to get a lot of traction, and I absolutely salute the way that the coalition is trying to avoid that. I think that it is worth repeating over and over that we have plenty of identity already. We've got plenty of identity registries. We've got plenty of ways of checking who somebody is in the real world, and if we could do the analog to digital conversion, we would nullify a lot of real problems. And separate to that, there's separately a policy discussion. I think that civil society needs to maintain that position. I think that national ID is probably not going to be helpful at this point, despite all the intuitions and the political noise about it. So it's just in the word, national ID. When I use ID with a capital, I'm talking about ID cards, and more power to your elbow to keep avoiding that that idea. It would be an expensive way of just creating another vulnerability, I think.
Thanks. Going through other questions, Richard wants to know, can we persuade NIST to actually recognize international standards where they exist and develop national profiles of them, rather than parallel standards? Maybe, probably not, at least in some areas. Actually, I will say, I think what NIST did with the cybersecurity framework and the privacy framework, certainly the CSF in terms of pointing to other standards that were flagged by industry, is actually the model of what we want to see them do here with this identity framework. The idea isn't not that NIST needs to write a new special pub, but that they should create something that's pretty similar to the CSF around identity that can point to other things. So in that regard, yeah, that's kind of the idea. There's a deeper discussion here to probably have over some whiskey.
Jeremy, absolutely. As somebody who's involved in several ISO committees that cut across exactly what you're talking about, and NIST is in every one of them, yeah, I would completely concur. What happened in that, where NIST decided to go out for industry consultation, not just going for agency consultation, was a breath of fresh air for everybody and a pleasant surprise. And I'm absolutely certain that providing the questions and the task is framed in the right way, so NIST don't feel they're having to step outside their normal box, I think there's a inherent willingness, but they are cautious about sticking within the federal box. And I'm just wondering how we might overcome that or help them overcome that.
If I may.
I mean, I had some efforts when I was there. It was occasionally we succeeded in changing things, and there was a lot of time beating my head against the wall. So that's, like I said, probably a broader discussion for whiskey, but
yeah, okay, I'll buy the virtual whiskey. You're okay.
Yeah.
We have some other folks just wanting to chime in there, just trying to give everyone a chance.
Well, I'll note that the two that you mentioned, Jeremy, are both voluntary documents, the frameworks that anybody can choose to adopt in their context, as opposed to the things that are proscriptive for federal information systems. So NIST does a pretty good job of distinguishing things that in its role it proscribes or prescribes for federal government authorities, as opposed to things that it says, here's a framework that you might find useful.
Yeah, although the CSF started off as being built for the private sector, and then government agencies were told you should follow it as well. Although there was the question of, but there's the framework and there's 853 and they cross-reference each other, and are they just creating another, there's again another longer discussion there about whether that accomplished anything. But yeah, there's stuff that's guidance for the private sector that's helpful, and then there's stuff that's prescriptive for government.
Yeah, you've been voluntold.
Yeah.
Here we go, moving along.
Yeah, Sal says we should fund a name change from driver's license. All for that, but not focused on now. John misspelled Richard's name, and I, without even the link, I'm pretty sure that's where we go from 12 to 13 standards XCCD comment. I think I know 927 very well when I see it now in the link. Wilshire told everybody how to spell his name. Martin, is there any thought about providing funding for federal agencies that are custodians of authoritative attributes? It costs them money to implement digital attributes, including the added security to manage, the added risk when these attributes are used more widely than their original purpose, like the social security number and the driver's license being prime examples. Talk a little more about that. I don't want to just riff on it without making sure I hear it from your perspective. I think you're on mute.
When I was working for government, I was trying to persuade, for example, DHS to make their list of people who could have access to protected infrastructure information available digitally to actually John Von Delt down in Georgia Tech. And I just encountered amazingly massive resistance, both from that's not how we do business. We send this list to one person in Texas who is supposed to take care of it from there. But also from the point of view of, we're not funded to do it that way. We're funded to do it the way we're doing it now. And I think that's true. That'll be true of non-federal custodians of authoritative attributes as well. But I do think, you have to recognize there is a business model issue if you're asking them to essentially provide a expanded service. So it'd be great if, there could be some funding allocated to actually implement those things.
Yeah, or, as I mentioned before, industry is willing to pay for this. So, it's worth, I don't know how closely you guys have followed what SSA has done over the last year with ECBSV. So
yeah.
yeah, it's worth spending 2 minutes on, to the extent we have time. SSA has for years had what was called the consent-based social security number verification system that said if you got a wet ink signature, they would say whether there's really a Jeremy Grant with a name and date of birth who's not dead. Well, that doesn't really work in digital, and the banks have been asking for years, hey guys, we passed the e-sign act back in 2000. Why can't we submit an electronic signature? And SSA, mostly because they didn't want to do it and nobody was forcing them to do it, said we're not going to do it. So the banks, actually got their act together and went to Congress. And when there was a big bank regulatory reform bill passed in 2018, there was language in it that said, SSA, you got to do it. But part of the compromise was we don't want you to start taking money from the Social Security Trust Fund that you're using for, benefits programs. So industry's got to pay for it. And what we've seen is, they were able to get 10 companies to put in collectively, I think $9 or $10 million in seed funding. And now that this thing is, stood up at scale, it's going to be less than a penny per inquiry, which is, about as, good a price as you could hope to see from the government or even a commercial service. There's all sorts of, again, speaking of whiskey, challenges SSA has had in terms of getting this stood up that we're working through with them. But, it is up and running in pilot phase, and they're about to a lot more banks. And, conceptually, everybody in industry said, look, we're willing to pay for this. This is really important information, especially when you look at all the synthetic identity fraud that takes place because we can't validate this basic information against the SSA's data. And so I think, there's, we talked about putting grants into the states because we think they're going to need more of an infusion of cash. But at the federal level, I think we could replicate the SSA model with, 3 or 4 other agencies potentially, and industry wouldn't blink.
If I may just add a point on that, fee-based is fine, but these are by nature monopoly services, right? They're unique services, so one does have to guard against the the agencies essentially providing them at too high cost over time.
There is that. The number of discussions I've had with banks who are participating in the pilot and aren't thrilled with some aspects of the service, who are complaining that the SSA is not acting like a traditional bank vendor, has been amusing. Like, what do you expect? I do think there's something to be said about whether there's a role for GSA to play here in terms of, look, do we need to have 5, 6, 7 agencies all stand this up, or could this be done as a managed service? That's certainly something I know, Phil Lamb has been interested in now that he's in that role over at GSA, but I think it's a little, that may be what comes out of this task force, but right now we're just trying to force the discussion, at a whole of government level to figure out what to do. So again, there's a lot the legislation doesn't specify. It's much more about getting a process in place to make the government do something rather than presuming we have all of those answers figured out right now. And our take was, it's going to be a lot easier to pass a bill that doesn't force anybody to do anything, but forces them to figure out how they're going to do something.
So there's a few questions there from Patrick Curry, whether you want to take them as a one or...
So regarding NSA, see the plain text document, FBI, NSA, civil liberties doc, which has influenced UN and global tech thinking on human rights, surveillance, and privacy, which depend on identity. I concur. And there's a lot of work on international operability. I think we've talked about this as well. Question, what about DOD? We didn't call them out, but arguably they should be in the task force. I mean, they're certainly an authoritative source for, separate from everything else you said there, I think they're an authoritative source,
veteran status,
for a lot of identity data. So
veterans are, so we're having exactly this in the UK, and it's not, and it's common in some other places as well, Australia, Israel, Germany, PTSD, mental health, and so on. There's a big crossover between veterans and societal dependence, as well as obvious national security reserve, etc. And an awful lot's coming out of this, and other things like military pension fraud, which oftentimes isn't veterans, it's other people. And it extends into fentanyl abuse, prescription drug abuse, and so on. So there's a lot of cross connections, and the beauty of doing it with veterans is that they're a very, very well-defined community which are highly trusted. It's just they've gone a bit off the road.
Right.
Yeah.
Christopher Williams is next up on your list, I think.
Yeah, discussion of the biometric challenges that go along with digital ID. We've kind of sidestepped those, honestly. I don't know that you need biometrics to do this. You know, I've always viewed biometrics as, you know, one arrow in the quiver of all of us as practitioners, and, you know, maybe there's a role and maybe there's not, but we didn't get that far, and, you know, we haven't really gotten into, you know, those issues too much. See, Tom's asking, do you know if AMBA's interested in this? We've met with them a few times. I mean, they've got, you know, the DLDD system, which covers some states, but not New York and California. They're, you know, eager to expand that. You know, that is an attribute validation service, so it's not one really that's rooted in consumer consent, which, you know, is potentially an issue. AMBA's interested. How interested, I'm not sure. The fact that Jeff Slagle just left, I don't think is good, since he was the one guy who seemed to have the most interest there, although I do know they're hiring to replace him. So I think AMBA could play a role here, but my take is they've had opportunities a couple times in the past to take a broader leadership role and have sort of opted not to do so. And so I think they're an important stakeholder, but until they decide that they want to play a bigger role, it's hard to count on them doing so. There's no way to make them.
Yeah, they're very active in Kantara's MDL discussion group and and Future Identity Coalition Council and various other places as well. So it feels to me that, you know, 1801 Part 3 Part 5 implementation is really high on their priority right now.
Yeah.
Well, they also wanted to charge a lot of money for queries to their database too, because they claim that the individual state members want to be able to make money off AMBA. So it's an interesting dilemma.
Yeah, I mean, there's, you know, separately, there's a bigger issue. If you look up the stories Joseph Cox has been writing in Vice and Motherboard this last year about how DMV data, how they're making millions of dollars off of it, and it's being sold to all sorts of places it's not supposed to go. Senator Wyden's office is working on a bill to actually close some of the loopholes in the Driver's Privacy Protection Act that was passed in the 1980s that's leading to some of that. That'll be an interesting thing to watch. We've been talking, we know Wyden's folks real well. We've been talking to them. I was initially worried when they were focusing on limiting DMV data that, you know, we'd somehow get stuck in that, but they very much get the difference between, you know, a company getting your data and for one purpose and then selling it for a second purpose relative to this consent-based model where, you know, consumers saying, hey, look, I'm trying to open a credit card, can you vouch for me? Yeah, there's going to be some other political issues there, I think, with the DMVs. I won't read all of Steve's quote other than I say I agree with everything he says around maybe there isn't necessarily increased costs. I mean, look, at the end of the day, when you look at what SSA is actually spending on this new system, I don't know that it's, you know, more than a, you know, tiny blip in their budget. But politically, I think the idea of the banks want this, make the banks pay for it was, you know, that was sort of the compromise that led things going forward. But yeah, there's other ways you could do this. Bob's comment, Section 6 suggests that the analysis of using SSN as an identifier versus some other kind of identifier is needed. Yeah, that's exactly the idea. There's a lot of, so one of the interesting things, I talked about this a little bit before, when we were writing the policy blueprints, and of course I got a, you know, bunch of, you know, banks and other companies in the room. I asked them, I said, why is it every time that a big breach happens and somebody's a victim, why do companies have SSNs? Why do you have them? And the answer was more often than not because we have to, because the law tells us we have to collect and retain SSNs. And, you know, so when we, you know, reached out to the you know, folks on the Hill who were looking at these issues and you know, that actually oversaw Social Security Administration, nobody had ever done an analysis of these requirements. So if you look at the Better Identity Coalition's policy blueprint, there's like a 6 or 7 page appendix at the end that, you know, one of the nice things about working in a law firm is I could grab a second-year associate and have her go off and look up all of the different requirements for, you know, where do industry, you know, and government have to collect and retain SSN. And we came to the conclusion that there's a bunch of requirements that make sense and there's probably some that don't. And so this is an idea of look, we're not going to replace the SSN, but that doesn't mean it has to be the only identifier, and it doesn't mean that its use is appropriate in every use case. And
it also has a lot of information in it, by the way. An SSN is structured in a certain way.
Yeah. So there's a lot of the take was, if you can't replace the SSN, let's at least look to see where we can minimize its use. John asked.
Yep.
So go ahead.
4 minutes. 4 minutes to run, so we'll speed up.
John says, should the task force include membership or representation from marginalized or equity-seeking groups for whom digital identity could be a vector for bad things? Yes, unless it creates a FACA problem. And so I think that's the thing. We've gotten that feedback from a lot of people. I think we might see a Senate counterpart version of this bill introduced that's going to have some tweaks, including that. And then it'll be a question of, my discussion with folks on this has been the goal, absolutely. We want to get a lot of input from stakeholders all across the board, not just industry. My question is, how do we do it without triggering a process that's going to take 3 years to do something that I think is relatively simple rather than 6 months? And so on our side, our take has been, look, if we can find a way to make this, bring more voices in for the task force to hear through workshops and requests for comment and all the things the government usually does without formally triggering the Federal Advisory Committee Act, that'd be great. What we're nervous about is, something that really slows it down. How could international experts engage? Again, it's, first the task force has to be created, then to be open to anybody in the world to provide comments through whatever channels can be there. Is there likely to be a Congressional Identity Caucus? There was a Congressional Identity Theft Caucus that Senator Kristen Sinema led when she was in the House, and then she got elected to the Senate, and I think it's fallen dormant. Maybe. Has anybody given the thought on changing the focus from digital identity to digital identification? Not yet. That might be the first. I don't know that one word versus the other is actually going to lead Americans to think about it differently. And then how do I expect law enforcement agencies for fin crime and cybercrime investigations to be involved? So we do have Treasury there. And I'll say one of our biggest champions in government has been FinCEN, the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network within Treasury. And so they are really interested in this. In fact, they've been trying to explore whether there's a way for Treasury to endorse the bill. Treasury and State Department did a soft endorsement of this bill about a month ago. They put out a report to Congress on human trafficking. And one of the things they pointed out is if you want to help victims of human trafficking get back on their feet, you need to help them get a bank account. You need to help them get a place to live. If they don't have identity, then they can't do that. And they specifically pointed to the Foster bill, saying Congress should consider passing legislation to put grants into the states to help people in situations like this, get up and running. So we were excited to see that. But anyways, how's it linked to Treasury counter-terrorist finance? I think FinCEN's their counterpart in the UK. Steve says blockchain caucus. I have definitely sidestepped both blockchain and biometrics. We're focusing on the policy layer, not the technical layer. I have many views on the technical layer as well, but we're not getting there right now. And Kantara says the questions are now closed. So,
well, just to give you a chance, I appreciate your voice is starting to, quake a bit there with an hour just full on, just as good, just as well you have water there. And just as we come to the top of the hour, I want to thank you so much, Jeremy. That has been incredibly informative and valuable, and so close to much of the work that Kantara itself is doing, not only the assessment insurance certification side of 863.3, but now with privacy and identity for MDL and pushing those parts out of the standard. So really, thank you very much indeed. Thank you to the global audience that have tuned in here. Really appreciate it, and wishing you all the best. Better Identity Coalition and the work you're doing there in support of the bill, and everyone else around the world. Thank you so much indeed.
I appreciate it. Happy to reach out offline if folks have questions. So thanks.
Okay. Yeah.
Thanks, Jeremy.
Yeah, we can provide Jeremy's email address. Is that okay? Yeah, I think it might be. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Jeremy.
Thanks.